Now it's my pleasure to welcome Ellen Lupton. Ellen is the curator of contemporary design at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York City, founding director of the graphic design MFA program at the the Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA in Baltimore, and she is an AIGA medalist. Please welcome Ellen Lupton.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Hi. Welcome from my various homes. I'm a curator at Cooper Hewitt, the nation's design museum, and we miss you. And we're doing lots of programming online and participating in events like this to stay in touch with our beloved community of designers. I'm also on the faculty at MICA. In these two roles of mine as a design curator and as a faculty member, I look at a lot of portfolios. I look at them in our admissions process. I look at them as a client of design at Cooper Hewitt. So I attend presentations by designers. I look at student submissions online. I work with my own students. They are always sharing their amazing work in presentations like this one. This has been a really tough summer. I just want to applaud the courage of every student and every designer who is struggling with hardship in this really tough year. And I'm really grateful to AIGA for providing resources to our community. These resources have been helpful to me in my own process of learning and unlearning, of listening to feedback from colleagues, from students, from people in the community about how to be better, how to be more just, how to really listen to what's going on in the world around us. I really love my community here in Baltimore where I live, and our AIGA local chapter posted this amazing piece at the beginning of the protests this summer. And it's profound. It names the individuals who are affected by violence in our world. So thank you to my friends and neighbors in Baltimore for all you do to support graphic design in our city. My subject today is storytelling. I am fascinated by what designers can do with storytelling, and Cooper Hewitt worked with me to publish this book in 2017 about storytelling as a tool for graphic design. And I'm going to focus on storytelling as a tool for you and your portfolio today. I'm going to show you lots of examples as we go of what people are doing in this moment, in our current historic moment, to use storytelling to educate and inspire their communities, but also building and preserving our own futures. You know, everyone is here today as a member of the world of design, but we're also all looking at our own place in it and our own future. And something like a portfolio festival, which is such a beautiful idea from AIGA, is really a moment to kind of reflect on your story. You know, your portfolio is your story of your work, right? It's your plan, your proposal, your manifesto, your proof of concept, right, as a designer. So I think it's really great to take this time to think about storytelling in your work. And I think many people at this moment are using storytelling as a tool for education, for educating their own community, for trying to create change in society. And I really admire that, and I'm grateful for it, truly grateful for it. So let's talk about storytelling. I'm going to start with a case study of a portfolio presentation that I saw recently and was really amazed by a young designer named Eden Liu. So let me tell you how I came to meet Eden. Every week this summer on Friday afternoons at 5 o'clock, Cooper Hewitt has been co-hosting an online conversation about design and COVID-19. So join us. We'll be doing it this week at 5 o'clock, and you can get a ticket for free on the Cooper Hewitt website. And one of the amazing designers that I got to meet is this wonderful young woman, Eden Liu. And I'm going to show you some screenshots from her presentation to give you a little taste of how powerful storytelling can be when you talk about your work. So many people tuning in today are working on a portfolio. Some of you are sharing your portfolio in the festival. And all of us use storytelling and narrative to explain what we do. So when I show you this project by Eden, I want you to look at 3 key ideas that you can apply to your portfolio presentation. So the idea of a narrative arc, a story that builds and concludes in a meaningful way. The idea of emotional range, stirring our emotions, but also having a variety of emotions in one piece. And then ending strong, ending with something really meaningful, personal, and passionate about your work. So here's Eden. And she did a project for an organization called The Last Mile, who provides a service of bringing personal protective equipment, PPE, to hospitals. And so as you know, there's a huge shortage of this equipment, and all hospitals are struggling to get this equipment, everything from masks to gowns. And so citizens around the country are actually helping to deliver this material, often from independent makers, to the hospitals. And so The Last Mile is an organization that makes that happen. And they approached Eden to make a logo. And so her story begins with a logo. And the logo is fantastic. It's a merger of a road and a Red Cross symbol. And so it brings together literally the story of this organization, right? Which is health and delivery and people on the road, like individuals, volunteers, helping to get this stuff where it needs to be. But Eden's story doesn't end with the logo. That was her entree to this organization. And as she came to know the organization, she realized that they had a lot more design problems than just a logo. And you probably met clients like this too, right? That think that all they need is a logo will solve their problems, but actually that design can do so much more. So Eden saw that The Last Mile had this very complex working process, a workflow. And they described it with these very technical graphs, like what you see on the screen. And she said, that work process is a story, and that story could be told in a much more compelling way, right? It could be told in a way that really helps people understand what the organization does and how they can get involved. And she realized that to tell that story, she needed icons, and she collaborated with some other wonderful designers to create icons. Each of those icons tells a story. And then these amazing illustrations take those icons to another level and really bring emotional intensity. So when you're creating a project, thinking about these kind of levels of emotion that you want, the clarity of information design, but also the passion that drives an organization, right? The human side, the real people, right? Not the Helvetica people, but the real people. And when she presented her work on our forum, she ended by saying, sometimes graphic design is like being a design janitor. And I thought this was very provocative and very interesting, because janitors are essential workers. Janitors are on the front line. And I think sometimes as graphic designers, we worry that we're not essential, right? Some of us are sitting at home in a chair for 5 months, right? Not leaving the house, and we don't feel that important. But if we could become as important as a janitor, that would be really amazing, right? And so many of us are involved in volunteer work and community work to have that impact on society. And so she concludes by saying, designers make tools to support others. And that's her philosophy, her manifesto, which is really supported in the Portfolio Project. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is take two of these principles, the idea of narrative arc and emotional range, and just look at a couple of ways that designers express that idea of time and arc and emotion. And these are tools that you can use in your work too. So narrative arc is a classic diagram that writers have used for over 200 years to describe the kind of typical rise and fall of energy in a story. So a story begins in a low place and it introduces us to a character, to a challenge, to a situation. And the energy of the story builds and builds until it reaches a climax. And then whoosh, just like going down the other side of a roller coaster, it brings us to a conclusion, right? We feel that we have finished. And of course, a portfolio presentation should always feel like that too, right? Like you've been somewhere, you went somewhere, there is energy, but there's also an end, right? There's a conclusion, we finish it up. We're seeing curves everywhere. It turns out that this arc of narrative is found all through nature. It's found all through human experience. It's used to describe the virus, right? And this particular graphic from April 2020 became a kind of icon for the virus. And of course, a story, a fiction, because we haven't actually come to the other side of this curve yet. And it's a way of picturing the energy of this thing and how we might defeat it, right? How we might fight against it. And this can be done in a very scientific way, but really it's storytelling. Really it's predicting the shape of a story so that we can understand it better and try to influence it. I follow a lot of doctors on Twitter, and this is a pretty good annotation of where we are now and what we have learned and not learned about the narrative arc of the virus, right? And there's a lot of wonderful organizations doing work in this area, creating design to try to solve some of the basic problems facing us in the pandemic. This is Emergency Design Collective, and I love the way they have visualized that arc of the virus and shown people taking action, right? Working against it and working together, working in a collaborative way. This amazing poster was released yesterday by Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York State, who designed this poster with the assistance of an unidentified graphic artist. And he has presented the arc of the virus as a mountain in this extremely narratively detailed poster. And I'll take you on a little tour of it, courtesy of Jason Farrago, an art critic for the New York Times, who picked out the kind of chapters of this story so we can enjoy it in its full dramatic force. So first, the virus arrives from across the ocean in a prop plane from Europe, right? We see our president airborne on a moon, overseeing the scene of disaster from quite a distance, right? We see the discovery that masks are actually a good idea. We see a whole team of essential workers fighting the virus, including Andrew Cuomo's children and dog, all equally heroic contributors to the fight, right? So that's some like storytelling that's very literal, right? And you may have projects that do this, whether they're journey graphs or storyboards or any kind of visual that sort of packs a lot of literal action into one frame. But often we break that action out into a sequence. Often the number 3 is something that designers use in their work, right? 1, 2, 3 signals beginning, middle, end, right? So if you're introducing a customer to a new service platform like this dog sitting service, showing people how easy it is, 3 easy steps, but also that has an arc, right, of entering into the service and then finding satisfaction at the end. This is a beautiful drawing by Amanda Lovelace about social distancing, and trying to show the social importance of this, that it isn't just for you to be safe, it's actually to keep people around you safe. And she chooses 1, 2, 3 characters for her story. And of course, we could have many more characters. But 3 is a number that's very familiar and accessible to people. It's a storytelling classic, right? 3 Little Pigs. This rhythm of 3-ness has a narrative logic to it that people really enjoy. This is a little bit tougher. This is from the Emergency Design Collective. And this is the 3 steps that you should take before going to the emergency room during a pandemic. And of course, each of these steps breaks down into lots of other steps. But to avoid making people feel overwhelmed in what's already an overwhelming prospect, breaking that into these 3 bands, these 3 phases, is really a way to bring comfort to people, because that 3-step process is something that we're familiar with and something that we feel more confident in than 20 steps. So let's think about the arc of a portfolio presentation, right? So we're talking about narrative arc. You want to choose the right number of pieces, right? So in my opinion, in a 10-minute talk, like many of you are doing, 3 is a really good number, okay? It's beginning, middle, end. It's something I can grasp. And each of those projects has its own arc, right? There's a story around it that you want to tell. And in terms of the entire rhythm of any presentation, a big mistake that I see a lot with my students, with people beginning in the field, and even with some really seasoned professionals, is people get really bogged down at the beginning of a presentation. They're nervous. They're finally here. They've been worried about doing this thing, and they put way too much time in the first few slides and then kind of peter out when they really get to the meat of the project. So it's really important to know when to stop, right? A story has a beginning. The beginning should be quick. Get us into the heart of it, and then know when to stop and how to stop. And then let's talk really quickly, because I'm aware of my narrative arc too, about emotion, right? That emotion is a really important part of design, and emotion comes through form, through color, through language. I love this hand washing poster by Datalands, which gives you this voice that's very accessible and feels like a friend talking to you, right? Not a super authoritative person. Or Jamie Hayon's really beautiful graphic for social distancing, which puts the social into it, right? These creatures love each other and they're not far away. They're close enough to really have a relationship, right? Or these wonderful social distancing graphics from the National Palace Museum in Taiwan, using pieces from their collection to visualize the idea of distance in relation to the human body, which is something we can really connect to. And so these pieces have an emotional warmth, right? They invite us in, even though the underlying context is kind of scary and negative. They have a welcoming quality to it. And then what about the emotions that we're all feeling right now, right? It is really a tough time, that feeling of isolation, the pressure to be productive, the uncertainty about the future. So this wonderful poster by Carlos Garcia O'Dowd really tries to capture the difficulty, right? The challenge of staying sane in our time. And he does that through some really spectacular storytelling, right? Lots of things happening. Or this graphic by Anya Kaitan. Imagine how your jeans feel. Nobody's wearing jeans anymore. We're all in our soft pants. And abandoned there in your drawer is a pair of jeans that really misses you, right? Really wants to have your time. Sometimes the instinct when we want to talk about something difficult is actually to avoid emotion. So this graphic from the Centers for Disease Control is kind of absent, right? The people have no faces, right? That we don't know what they're feeling. It's very abstract. And so I much prefer this design by Mona Chalabi about COVID symptoms, where she allows this to be an emotional experience, right? She has empathy for us and our emotional state of mind. Or the incredible graphics being created by artists for Black Lives Matter, who are conveying the heroism of individuals, conveying anger, but also showing what actions are needed, right? Pointing a path forward in a very resolute way. These graphics express sorrow, they express pain and solidarity, and they look at where the problems are in society, right? They point up at where these problems are coming from. And I think the ability to express love and sadness as well as rage is really important. I think in our moment, we need to have access to all the possibility of human emotion. So let's think about that in relation to a portfolio presentation, right? So you come to your portfolio with emotion, with the love you have for design, with the commitment you have for your work. And when you present your work, I think it's really important to vary your intensity over the course of your discussion, right? That you don't have to systematically give every project the same number of slides or the same attention, that you can kind of highlight some projects as being those that have the most depth. And by depth, I mean depth of research, but also importance to you and to your view of what design is. I think it's great to use humor to break up heavy stuff, right? But it doesn't mean you have to be telling jokes all the time. You know, that humor should be a way to create a shift, right? To change the mood. And then finally, how do you feel about the work? Where is your passion, right? Share that passion. So you are all on a path. A story is a path. We don't know where the path is going. We're all trying to shape the path, predict the path, work together to make sure we get to a good place. I'm just so proud of everybody in our field right now, my students, all the designers who are working, protesting, educating, telling the truth, making people like me listen to the truth, making us all listen. You all have so much to give and so much love and promise ahead of you. I'm going to end on this emotional note, which is this beautiful mural in London by Yinka Alori. Better days are coming, I promise, he says. And he's created this mural as a piece that is explored in time. It's explored as you walk past it or bike past it. It's a story that unfolds. And I'm really excited now to hear the stories of some amazing designers who are going to share their work with us. And I am just delighted about learning from them. But I think first, Lishan and I are going to chat a little bit.
Thank you so much again for that presentation, Ellen, and for all the folks joining in for the lively chat and activity in the Q&A pod. So I'll just launch straight into things. There is a question from somebody in the chat pod, from Jed, in fact, about the use of the first person. You know, you've talked about emotional range and putting ourselves in our work, and for a lot of designers, it's very personal, but we sometimes get conflicting advice about talking about yourself in the first person versus the third person, like in, say, an About Me
Yeah.
page. Any
Well,
thoughts?
that's very interesting. Actually, this came up yesterday in the discussion with Dan Mall too about first person. I think first person is really great. I think it expresses your commitment to who you are. So in an about page on your website, if it's really your website about you in particular, or it's Behance, right? It's your profile. I would definitely use the first person. However, if it's a website that's collective, so it's about you on a page with other colleagues or staff members, then I think third person is better.
And another clarifying question in terms of Nivard wanted to know about, do the same principles of storytelling that you were talking about, would they apply to an online portfolio or across different portfolio presentation styles and media?
Yeah, so I was really talking more about when we present our work, which is a very narrative process. So whether that's in a job interview or it's presenting your work to a client, you know, in order to get work or to pitch a project. That's what I'm talking about, really, the examples that I gave. But the idea of storytelling really drills down into each thing that we do, right? Each piece that we create has action, has time, has emotion. And I think that those principles are really, really universal.
This topic of storytelling, I think, has been having a moment for a while now. And like anything that becomes a business trend, sometimes there's a backlash against it. So reflecting on an anonymous comment that we got, this person went to film school a few years back and is now in design, and they're trying to figure out how they talk about that. You've talked about emotional range, but sometimes that professional range or perceived lack of focus by employers is something that folks have to deal with. So do you have any thoughts on that, of like, how do you actually make storytelling a core skill that's valuable?
The way I think about it in my work is that storytelling engages an audience. And if you think about everything you're doing in terms of how is the user or the receiver, the reader, you know, the person, the other person, how are they going to engage with you? To me, storytelling is the way that you get people interested, right? Is that you make them curious. Stories make us feel, right? And that means emotions, but it also means sensory reactions. All stories are temporal. So if we think about design as just like a thing, right? A thing just sits there, but really almost everything we create is perceived over time. Even a poster like Andrew Cuomo's poster is extremely temporal, even though it's a flat, fixed thing. To experience it, you have to read it over time.
Right. Well, and on that poster too, it seems to be a reference to these like Gilded Age posters as well, right? And I'm not sure if everybody picks up on that in terms of the general public looking at that poster right now.
Yes, he is a big fan of 19th century narrative painting and narrative graphics.
Although it also comes across as this kind of like MySpace or internet meme kind of execution, right? The way that it's happening now. But on that point, since you just chuckled, there's a question about humor and how to balance that out with seeming professional and credible, and how do you insert humor in a way that lands well?
I really love humor. I love to read about it. I love to hear about the patterns of it and how it works. I think there's a lot of structures in humor that are really valuable, even if you're not trying to be funny. Like actually the idea of three and the three-part structure is very important for comedians who do a kind of the first two things are normal and the third is a break in the pattern. That's called the rule of threes. I just think humor makes people feel comfortable. It makes them feel welcomed, as long as it's not at their expense, right? So humor also has the danger to be to exclude some people in your audience. So it's important to be careful with humor as well as having fun with it.
Yeah, that's a great point about comedians and the rule of three. I think the easiest one that I remember as like a rule of thumb is the 6-word story that you often see outside of bars, right? Free beer, nude bartenders, false advertising. And it sort of takes you somewhere and then it's like, aha, but then maybe you go in and pay for your beer anyway.
Right, that's a beautiful example. And there's a whole story there, right?
Right. And it's a lot less depressing than the Hemingway one about the baby shoes never worn, right? And it actually brings you
Yes.
in some way.
That's great.
There are some questions we're getting from people who are in the process of transitioning. And so how do they tell that story that's a work in progress? You know, how much do they dwell on the past versus where they want to go, even if they haven't made that work yet?
Well, I think when we're transitioning from, one profession to another or one part of life to another, I think it's really important to see how that history is part of what you bring to your work. So you mentioned the filmmaker. Well, wow. I think it's amazing that a designer would have experience in filmmaking and would have that knowledge of structure and technique and time and sequence and light and shadow. Like, that's fantastic. So seeing that past experience as an asset and as being part of what you are bringing forward into design, to me is really key. It's part of what a screenwriter might call backstory. And
Right.
backstory is important, valuable.
Thank you. And thanks so much again for the folks who have been typing in these great questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Again, on this point that we have an educator question about how to get students to open up more about their story rather than something that maybe they're Googling or something that they think that their peers or potential employers are looking for. And I guess it's about vulnerability and the specificity of how to get students to open up about that in their work.
Well, I think the key is to ask them, and if we don't ask students to bring themselves to the work, then they'll feel that that's not welcome. One project I've done with my students and in workshops is a personal journey map where students take the time to kind of map out their own history of influences, the intellectual influences, the mentors, their ancestors, both intellectually and in their life, through their family tree. And to also include in that looking to the future, what do they want to do? And I find students really respond to this and might not do it on their own, might not do it if there wasn't a context created where you're invited to do that and share it with others. So I think it's really a question of invitation.
Yeah, thank you. On that point, there's also telling other people's stories. You shared some examples from the defund police movement or Black Lives Matter. There's a question about how do you create work when it's not necessarily your story to tell, if it's about another community that you're supporting. And we've seen a lot of stuff on Twitter about that recently too, right? About these movements not necessarily being your portfolio project or a reason for you to self-promote. So how would you give advice about navigating those questions?
Well, I would be very wary. I think it's really important to listen to what a particular community wants. And if the community doesn't want every student to make a BLM poster, then don't do it. We have more to learn by looking at the art created within the community. All the examples I showed are from that community, not outsiders interpreting it. And I think this has been a real learning time for everybody and very humbling, and a time to really try to listen and read and follow others, right? Follow
Yeah,
what's going on and not assume that your voice is the one that should be centered.
for sure. And I also think about people putting their work out there as part of the dialogue, right? And even if they do mess up or folks get called out for different things or it upsets people, it's still part of that conversation, even if like listening is an important part, but in some ways, people are still putting themselves out there in a way, and it's more about the accountability sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's going to be called out. I've been called out. It's very painful. It's part of being a leader. It's part of being a person that is supposed to be leading. And it's a learning experience. And I think it's better to participate and speak up and say what you need to say, even though it's risky, than to retreat and be silent. Because that's a safer thing to do.
Yeah, and pivoting on that in terms of belonging and story, we heard from somebody in the chat who comes from a non-traditional design background. So they didn't go to design school, and now they're trying to kind of tell the story of why they belong in design as a field. And do you have any thoughts on that or advice to give to somebody who's basically making up their own story and doesn't come from a traditional design school background?
Well, design is for everyone. I mean, design is a universal activity, and design benefits from the input of all kinds of people. So I believe that design is a welcoming field. I think graphic design especially is very accessible and has roles for all kinds of people to play, from a role in your everyday life or in your work with your community to professional work. I think it's quite a broad and inclusive practice.
Thank you. We're getting a couple requests for actually to back up to that slide you showed about the principles of storytelling. I don't know if you want to share your screen again or
Sure.
maybe just voice that over, but you're welcome to do it either way.
So the idea of the arc of a portfolio presentation, right? The two principles I really talked about in detail have to do with the idea of an arc, with every story having is really about an action, right? That has a complete a rising and falling energy. And so that in a good story, we really have a sense of beginning, middle, and end. And then each chapter in a story also has an arc of energy. So that's something to really think about as you put together a presentation about your work or create any kind of time-based project, that you have that sense of an arc. And then we also talked about emotion and the idea of being emotional, right? Of creating work that connects to people, right? That isn't, we don't boil out all of the feeling from it. So I showed some examples of, work that really tries to connect to people emotionally. And in storytelling, to have a range, that you're not always shouting or you're not always laughing and kidding around, the annoying guy you might have met who's just always joking and always pushing and jabbing at people, right? Everything's a tease, like that's annoying.
Right.
So having range, right? Having variation in how you speak and converse about your work, I think is really important. So does that help?
Yeah, thank you for
I hope
reviewing
that
that, because I
that
think we had some
answers that.
folks who just missed it the first time or joined in late, so it's helpful to revisit
Okay.
that. And also for the folks who maybe missed yesterday's session, I think a really good example of this is if you check out Kevin Leonard, who was the third designer to present yesterday. He's a more seasoned professional, but he started out with showing some of his corporate identity work, and then it got fun, and then it got very personal and political around Black Lives Matter and what it meant for him as a Black man. And so I thought that was a really interesting
Mm-hmm.
journey that he took us on as well. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. let's see, which one will I pick? There's so many. Thank you so much again for everybody's questions. How then, like you mentioned 3 projects, and I think folks are having
Yeah.
trouble choosing. How do you get down to that 3 when there's, you want range, but then also you have a time limit. So do you have any tips on how to
Well,
narrow things down?
yeah, I mean, I have to do it all the time. I mean, storytelling is editing, right? Above all. So if you think about, a great movie or a great episode of Breaking Bad, a lot of the action is actually what gets left out.
Mhm.
Somebody gets shot, but we actually just hear it. We don't see it, right? The
Yeah.
the cuts are really important. Um, and I think we have a tendency, because our work is so personal to us, that we want to share it all. And you just get more impact when you edit and make choices. Writers call it killing your darlings, which is very dark. But it really means being able to go back to something you created and say, you know what, even though that's a beautiful description of a pine tree in the moonlight, it doesn't move my story forward, and I'm cutting it. You know?
Right.
And so being able to do that, it takes a lot of courage, but the work is still there for the next presentation. So keep it compact, and your audience will love it. They'll get more from it.
Thank you, Ellen. A really great point about storytelling is editing and leave them wanting more.